I went to NYU, back east,
Right.
New York University, for a bachelor's degree. I was going to become a doctor. At that time, it was extremely difficult to become a doctor, no matter how good your grades were, if you were Jewish.
Right.
You just couldn't do it. If your father was a physician, that helped. If he was a senator, that helped. If he was a congressman, it helped. A lot of things helped.
Yeah.
Grades didn't mean too much because so many young Jewish guys trying to become doctors had terrific grades. First of all, I must say this about my bachelor's work. Somewhere in there, I took an English literature class. And one day, I got a paper back. It was a test. I had to write an essay of some sort. And it didn't have a grade on it. It just, in red, I still have the piece of paper somewhere. It was a couple of pages. In red crayon, it said, get out of pre-med and become a writer.
Ah.
So somebody knew more than I did. I had no idea that I was any great shakes as a writer. I'm still not sure of that sometimes. Anyway, that's what he said, but I paid no attention.
Yeah.
I was also told by the schools that if I had a master's degree in something to do with medicine, you know, some...
Yeah.
So I came out here to SC, Southern California, and took a master's degree in medical sciences and psychology, hoping that might get me into, with 2 degrees, I might get into a medical school the following year. And I came out here and I lived with my brother Al. He gave me room and board. And I went to school and got my master's degree, and he was doing the Bob Hope Show.
Yeah.
Well, there was about, 6 or 7 episodes yet on the Bob Hope Show when I finished my master's work. It never seemed to me to be very difficult to write jokes.
Yeah.
So I said to Al, maybe if I write a couple of jokes and you get them to Bob, he'll give me $5 a joke or $10 a joke, which was eating money, rent money practically in those years.
This is Bob Hope on the.
This is Bob Hope
on the radio show, right?
Yeah, on the
Right.
Pepsodent radio
Right.
show. So Al said, sure. He said, I'll tell you the topic and you can write some jokes. So I did. I wrote some jokes and they got big laughs. I just wrote monologue,
Yeah.
which is his pride and joy. It always was his pride and joy. So Al gave them to Bob. Bob used some for 4 or 5 weeks, whatever was left of the season. And then Bob's agent, Jimmy Safier, called me. And he said, Bob wants you to come on the show this coming year. He said he liked your material. And I said, well, that was not my intention. Meanwhile, I'm not getting paid anything for the jokes. And he said, Bob would like you to come on the show. So I said, Jimmy, I'm supposed to try to become a doctor this coming year. Medical school, I'm told, is sometimes will let you through, regardless of your religion, if you have 2 degrees. He said, when are you going to know about this? He said, because Bob is leaving for England. He's going to spend the summer there. And he said, let me talk to Bob. And Bob did something which was extraordinarily nice. He said, I don't mean for Bob, I mean for anyone.
Yeah.
He said, suppose we draw up a contract and I'll sign it. If you don't get into medical school, you sign it. Well, talk about
Yes.
an alternative. Armed with that, I went back to a couple of the colleges that seemed most promising. One of them was Flower, New York, Flower Hospital. And they had an outstanding medical school. And so I went back there. I had been there previously, but I went back again because I felt I could do something dramatic, which I did in the meeting with the assistant dean. He said, and I knew the question is coming because it always comes, how important is it for you to be a doctor? They always ask that question. I said, well, look at this. And I took my contract, 7-year contract. He didn't know it had 13-week options. But I, at some point in our conversation, I said, I have here a 7-year contract with Bob Hope. who was an enormously successful, always says, I know about that show, because it was like a runaway hit, the
Sure.
Pepsodent show.
Sure.
And I said, I'll tear it up in front of you, if that indicates how important it is.
Yeah.
And he said, let me share something with you that I seldom share with an applicant. I found out something which to this day doctors deny ever existed. Mm-hmm. But the AMA would tell different medical colleges, for example, in Nebraska there were very few Jews. Mm-hmm. So 0 Jews were allowed there. Mm-hmm. And so forth around the country. Mm-hmm. It was their contention that since Jews constituted, and still constitute, about 3% of the population, that should be the percentage of Jews that are doctors. Mm-hmm. What difference it makes to you whether a guy is going to save your life, whether he's Jewish or Chinese or black or whatever. Nevertheless, that's what they thought. Mm-hmm. And I was caught. And this was only, I think, in a 6-year period. Mm-hmm. Because when the war came along in 1941, they suddenly changed the rules. Mm-hmm. It was okay to be Jewish and a doctor if you could get killed, apparently, but otherwise, these are the rules. Mm-hmm. In that same meeting with the assistant dean, he gave his pad to me, which he was supposed to fill out about our interview, and he said, with a challenge, he said, you fill it out. Say anything you want. He said, I'll sign it, and you won't get in. Which is pretty discouraging. Yeah. Of course, I didn't fill it out, but then he filled it out, and he insisted that I read it, and it was glowing. And we said goodbye, and then I get this telegram from Flower Medical School saying that I was the #1 alternate, which means if one guy who they agreed to take in decides to go elsewhere, I would be the first one that they would call. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it said, stand by for a second telegram. I'm still standing by. That's 56 years ago, I guess, or 57. I don't know how many years ago it is. Yeah. In fact, I'm tempted every year to send them a telegram saying, enough is enough. Yeah. A man loses patience after. When is the second telegram going to get here? As soon as the class started. When the class started in New York,
I see.
I just said, okay, I'm not going to be a doctor.
Yeah.
And I apparently have some talent for writing jokes that appeal at least to Bob Hope.
Sure.
And so that's what I did. And that's what I started. I wrote for Bob for 4.5 years.
Yeah.
At which time I was drafted from his show into the Army. And then a remarkable thing happened. They made me a writer. Usually, if you were a tailor, they put you in the print shop.
That's right.
Or whatever you did had nothing to do with where you arrived.
We have a photograph behind you of Bob Hope and his writers, in which you as a young man and Mel Shavelson as a young man are seated with Bob Hope. That was 38
or 39, either one or the other.
Yeah. The Bob Hope radio show was tremendously popular among servicemen.
Yes.
And you went in, you were drafted in 43,
early 43 or late, I really don't remember. But it was in 43.
Okay, and then let's pick this up then. You went into writing?
Armed Forces Radio Service.
Armed Forces Radio Service.
It was a unique group of guys.
Yeah.
All of us. And there must have been 8, something like that, 8 or 9 maybe. All had been professional writers on various important comedy shows, because most of it was comedy that was in the Armed Forces Radio, in the entertainment division. And we would just team up each week and do 2 or 3 all different shows. Sometimes there would be 4 guys on a show, it was heavy comedy. Sometimes it would be 2 guys, sometimes 1 if it was just a simple, what they call melody roundup, which was just introducing different songs. And then it's funny to think of it this way now, but there was a show called Jubilee, which was all black. So all the performers were black in that show. And it's also hard to think that in those days, even though it was the Army, there was not in our unit, but there were separate drinking fountains for whites and blacks. It was, it's hard to think that that has happened during my lifetime. Nevertheless, it has. And Bill Morrow, who had written for Jack Benny, was one of the writers. And Marvin Fisher, and Jack Rose, who had been on the Bob Hope show, was one of the writers. And there were guys from the Navy in there too. Jess Oppenheimer was in the Navy, yet he was in the Armed Forces radio. Charlie Isaacs was, I think, Coast Guard or Navy. So there was a group of very competent, Frank Galen, who had then written and developed 2 series, I think.
Jess Oppenheimer later created Lucy?
Lucy,
is that correct?
right,
Yes.
right. And the producers were like Bob Welch had produced the Jack Benny show, and there was producers and so forth and so on. We were all privates or maybe corporals, I don't really remember. And all the people in charge of us were from the advertising agencies. And they were all lieutenants and officers of one kind or another.
After the service, after the war, after your writing with the Armed Forces Radio Service, did you go right to work on a radio show after that?
Well, there's kind of an interesting point, because Bob assumed.
This is Bob Hope.
Bob Hope assumed that I'd be coming back to his show. And I really didn't want to, meaning no disrespect for Bob or the show, but it was a blind alley kind of show. You had to write jokes which you knew in advance he was going to like or not like, because he has very specific tastes. So you were confined on the show to doing a joke about Hedy Lamarr, or a joke about this one or that one, or Hollywood Park was opening. I mean, there were certain guarantees. And I didn't feel that creatively it would lead anywhere. And I think he was hurt when I didn't come back, because I had to tell this to him directly. Jimmy said, "You better talk to Bob about this." And I did. And he said, "I'll do new jokes." I said, "Bob, you say that, but I know you." And I said, "I don't mean it. I mean, you've been terrific to me, but I just want to move on into other kinds of things." And what I moved on to was Ozzie and Harriet, which was situation comedy, a different avenue for me. So I was with Ozzie and Harriet for the first year, and then my brother Al left Bob, and then we did a show that was not successful, but at least I was leading into other places. My brother Al didn't have the same kind of feelings I had. He went back to Bob after that initial year, and I continued to work on other things. And one of the other things was a radio show called Beulah, which was every night. And that was another thing. That's what I meant by...
Beulah was Louise...
No, Hattie McDaniel.
Hattie McDaniel, I'm sorry.
In television, she was Louise Beavers.
Louise Beavers.
And in radio, she was Hattie McDaniel.
Now, this was one of the very first, if not the first, shows with a black lead. Is that...
Yes. And we received all kinds of commendations from the NAACP because everybody in that show was employed gainfully and respected in the community. And Ruby Dandridge came from that show. Dorothy Dandridge was her daughter. And she was just a little kid on that show. And it was quite successful. And then television happened. And that really shook up entertainment. That was a big, big happening. I went over into television land, where I did the Joan Davis show.
Oh, yes.
With Jim Backus
Right.
as her husband.
Very popular show.
Yeah, it was. It was very similar to I Love Lucy.
Mm-hmm.
I was there for 2 years when I decided I had an idea for a play. And, you know, a writer is nothing if he isn't reaching for the unreachable, like the song says, the unreachable star. And so I wrote a play. And it was on in the summer times for some years, and eventually became a 2-hour TV special, which I adapted for television.
What was the name?
It was called Mr. and Mrs.
Mm-hmm.
And Lucille Ball and Bob Hope were in it.
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was okay. It was thin,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess it didn't deserve a big Broadway life looking back.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you always hope for that when you're young and ambitious, and the word passionate comes to mind.
Yeah.
Later on, you reserve the word passion for other things, because it was just a funny play.
Let me interrupt just for a second. To go from the radio writing, which was essentially the creation of jokes, into more of a situation comedy, that's a huge leap to go to Broadway.
I guess. I never think that way.
But you didn't think of it that way.
No.
Yeah.
I just felt I could do anything I wanted.
Yeah.
You know, you have that advantage when you're young. You don't know at that point that other people don't think you can do anything you want. They think you can do what you just did.
Yeah. Well, did you do any particular preparation for theater writing after doing a situation comedy?
Of course, I got another pencil. That's about it.
Yeah. So you had an instinct about it, and it just worked.
It may sound egotistical, but I feel I can do anything I want if I have enough time and a piece of paper.
Sure.
I was with Red Skelton for about 7.5 years.
Yeah.
And it was while I was with Red, or against Red, depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
He looked at it as against. I was against him. So if he could overcome whatever it is I wrote, he could somehow make a successful show of it.
Yeah. I want to say that Red Skelton was one of the most popular comedy entertainers in the early days of television. One of the most popular.
But when I came along, he was in 78th place on CBS. He was already in big trouble. And it's a funny thing, you raise something which I think is terribly important. In those years, the advertising agencies ran television, not the networks. Right. So meetings that I had were with ad agencies about whatever I was doing, whether it was Gilligan's Island or whatever happened, until 1961 or 62. I think it was 62. And you rarely hear the name Newton Minow.
Yes.
But in my opinion, he's the most important single individual in the history of television.
He was the chairman of the FCC.
FCC.
Yes.
And it was he who decreed, because of the scandals of the quiz shows and payola with the disc jockeys charging to play certain songs. And what he did, he didn't mean to do. And the networks didn't even understand. They had just been given the keys to the kingdom and didn't know it. He said at an NAB, National Association Broadcasters Convention, his famous vast wasteland speech, he said that he now places each network in charge of every show. They are to police every show. Well, you can't make a guy a policeman without giving him a gun. They didn't even know that. It took them 2-3 years before they realized they were in charge. Whatever they said went, because it was their network. They could always say, that's the music that conducted, it should be on that show, because we're protecting our network. The same for the writers, the same for the producers. He put them in charge of everything. You've heard the name S.S. Minnow? Not named after the little fish. It's named after Newton Minow.
Right.
I spelled it with 2 N's. His is spelled with one. But I said, at the time, I knew it.
Yeah.
When I heard that speech, I knew that was a death knell for ad agencies' control. That was the end.
Yeah.
It was going to be all network after that.
Yeah.
And so I think that, in a sense, he wrecked television. So I wrecked his little boat, the SS Minnow.
Yeah.
And but nobody knows that except you and me and whoever's watching.
I was in live television and had the pleasure of sneaking into a Red Skelton
Rehearsal?
which was celebrated. Would you tell us about the Red Skelton rehearsals?
Well, it was called the Dirty Hour,
Yes.
and aptly named. It was an hour. The show was only a half hour, but that show ran an hour, and it was dirty. I mean, every filthy, terrible joke he could think of, either visual or verbal, he would throw into that half hour. How he had these two different minds, I don't know. But that was in the afternoon. At night, somehow, he took this part of his mind out so that the dirt was out, and he kept the clean stuff in. I don't know how he was able to do that. But the rehearsals were packed. Every secretary in the building.
Yes.
I shouldn't say just secretary, other people too. But they were always there. And he was filthy, dirty, and funny. I mean, I can't even repeat
Yeah.
at a stag some of the things that he did in that dirty hour of his. I had a funny arrangement with him. The head writer who preceded me, or so the story went, was Artie Stander. I don't
Yes.
know if you
Yes.
remember Artie.
Yes.
A little guy with a big temper.
Yeah.
And he was the head writer. Red took exception to a script one time. And I tell you, when your ratings are going down, and as they were, he was in 70-something place, like 76th place in the ratings.
Mm-hmm.
After having started out at the top, he just nosedived. He asked Artie to come out to his house. He had a big knoll on in Bel Air somewhere. Red was always had firearms of some sort around him. He liked guns. So Artie went there and to start to talk about the script. Whereupon Red took out a gun and shot at his feet, not meaning to hit his feet, and said, maybe this will make you write funnier.
Oh.
Well, Artie just got the hell out of there and reported this, and they said, well, he's a strange man, CBS said. He was also a strange man who was a major talent. That makes a difference. Then they called me, and they said, because I had saved a couple of shows. I had come in, and I forget, Favorite Martian was in trouble, and so CBS put me into that, and I straightened that show out, at least to their satisfaction, and to the world. I mean, it was a very popular show. Now they wanted me to come in. And I said, look, I know what's happened. At least I've heard a version of what's happened. I said, I got to tell you, I have 10 toes. And I like every one of them. And I don't intend to work for this man or with this man. So they said, well, would you take a look at what he's been doing? Maybe we can we pick your brain? I said, anybody can pick my brain. My brain is pickable. And so they sat me down in a viewing room, and they showed me, at that time it was kinescopes. They showed me, I don't know, 4 or 5 of his shows. To me, it's funny, when you have a solution to something, you wonder why nobody else saw the same thing you saw. It was obvious to me that they had taken a marvelous pantomimist, a great pantomime entertainer, and they had given him verbal material. He couldn't say 6 words straight to save his neck or any other part of his body. I was going to use a different word. Anyway, they said, he's doing the wrong material. They said, what way? So I said, he should be doing a different show. Also, he was doing piecemeal shows. He was doing a kind of show that has never succeeded, before or after. It has never succeeded. To do pieces. He would do 6 minutes of The Mean Little Kid. He would do 6 minutes of Freddie the Freeloader. He would do 6 minutes of Cauliflower McPug. And I said, then people know what to expect every week. There's no surprise. Yeah. They said, what would you do? I said, I would do a situation comedy about one of his characters one week, and the next week, another one of his characters. So every 5th week, they would never be tired because they hadn't seen that character for a month. So he would be his own guest star, so to speak. He would be Freddie, or he would be whoever. Clem Cadiddlehopper was another one of his characters. They were all his characters. I make no claim. I did not add that. I just changed the entire nature of the show. Instead of piecemeal, I made it a situation comedy show. And to keep that true to itself, there had to be a half-hour story. And so I invented a thing called a pantomime monologue. So very few words were used. He would set up a situation verbally, not necessarily with a joke, usually with a joke. If in one case it was, he was Freddie the Freeloader and it was Thanksgiving coming, he would say about himself now, in one. He'd talk in one and say, I decided to go out and buy a turkey farm, get my own turkey. And he'd say, you know, those turkeys are pretty smart. They know somebody's coming to get them. And then he would proceed to do, as written in the script,
Sure.
A lame turkey. He'd hobble around saying, who was going to buy a crippled turkey? Or he would, nobody's going to buy a sick turkey. And so he would make evasive moves when people came around to buy him. And he's a master at that.
Yes.
That's what he could do.
Sure.
So it was a visual monologue, no, as few words as possible. And then the story followed just Freddie's adventure that particular week. And that's someplace around here is an award I won. I won several from the Gilligan.
It's behind you there, and it's Freddie's Thanksgiving?
Freddie's Thanksgiving.
Yes.
I'll tell you how that happened. This is a funny thing how sometimes accidents turn into unusual, which is what I love, when something's unusual. If I can do something nobody ever did, I'm all for it. The producer and I were in a good team. And Cecil Barker.
Yeah.
And we saw pretty eye to eye. He knew what I was saying was right. Stick to pantomime and leave the jokes out wherever possible. CBS, in order to entice me, since I didn't want my toes pierced, although now they pierce everything, don't they?
Sure do.
Anyway, they said, well, suppose we arrange it so that you never have to meet with Red. I said, how are you going to do that? Well, he's sinking, so a sinking man will clutch at straws. We'll make that part of the arrangement. You deliver the script. If he wants to add a little something, take away a little, that's up to him. But he will be handed a script. And he never knew from one week to another what character he was even going to play. I was on the show for over 7 years, never had a meeting with him, ever. And this particular time we wrote a script which was loaded with pantomime, where he was going from one place to another trying to get a Thanksgiving meal, because he was penniless. He was a hobo, Freddie the Freeloader. And I turned it in to Cecil Barker, and he read it. He says, very funny. He said, but I know how much you like pantomime, but there's hardly any jokes in this. And he said, reread it. I think it needs maybe another 15 jokes scattered through here somewhere. So I reread it, and I said to myself, wait a minute now. I don't know how many jokes were in there to begin with. Maybe there were 10, 12, 15, I don't know what there were. But I said to myself as I was reading, I don't need this joke. I don't need that joke. well, this joke, not with this man's abilities, this all can be done in pantomime. And I said, by God, it's a half-hour story show with the greatest, I believe, the greatest pantomime artist ever. Because we had Marcel Marceau on our show, and Red put him away. I mean, he's great. And so I came back, and I said to Dave and to Jess, you know what I think? I think we can pull all the jokes out. It's tough, because it's a story show, but I think it's possible. They were already at work on next week's show that we had decided on. They were working on the script while I was having these meetings. And they said, geez, that's impossible. And then they used the magic phrase, nobody's ever done that before. Well, when I hear that, that's like a red flag to me. And I said, that doesn't mean we can't do it. And he said, well, it's impossible. How about this point? How about this point? I said, well, tell you what, let me fight this out with Cease. And I went to see Cease Barker, and I said, I have an idea. And I told him what the idea was. And he says, I don't think you can do it. I said, that's not the point. Suppose I can do it. Would you do it? He said, you can't do it. It's a story. What about this point? What about that? There's like 3, 4 major points that tell the story. I said, let me worry about that, okay? He said, well, you don't have much time. So went back, talked to Dave, talked to Jess, and they said, look, this is a stone wall. You can't climb that wall. You can't go around that wall. It's a stone wall. Anyway, I said, okay. I mean, there wasn't, to me, there didn't seem to me that much work. And they said they were busy with the other show. And, you know, those years, their Saturday, Sunday meant nothing. Maybe in these years, they still mean nothing. And they're working on the next show. I said, I'll do the rest myself, because we all did 9/10 of the work. Let me do the last 10th. So I spent that weekend, and it was tough work. It really was tough to do a whole story. But I did it. Gave it to Cease, and he said, he was amazed. He said, I didn't think you could do it. I said, well, let's do it. Pick up Time magazine. And there's a big quote from Red. He finally was able to get the writers to do what he'd been begging them to do for years. A show with no words.
No words.
All in pantomime. So that's how that story went. And that year, I won the Writers Guild award for a script which had no words. It was 34, 35 pages of directions.
Yeah, I think that was the only one. I mean, I think that was rare, certainly the first one. I don't remember that there was a pantomime show.
I don't remember that there ever was or ever again.
Yeah, but he was a brilliant mime. Yeah.
Also crazy.
Yeah. During that time, were you working? You were working singly, alone. Is that, or were you with a team?
Well, the three of us were in the room.
Right.
It's hard to say.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I was, quote, the head writer.
Yeah.
And so they worked with me, for me, however you want to put it. But I'm very adjustable. I can work by myself. I can work with 2 guys in a room, 6 guys in a room. Doesn't matter to me.
Did you ever have a preference?
No. I just did whatever came along. In the Army, you learn to work with a new guy every day.
Yeah, sure.
Because we kept getting reassigned to different projects.
Yeah.
I left there. It's funny. My wife does have some influence. She hated the idea that I was working for a man who was now the #1 comic who hated writers, detested them. Why? For the usual reason. You hate somebody who you know you need. Mm-hmm. And he knew he needed us, and therefore hated us. Mm-hmm. Psychologists can explain it, I can't explain it, but that's the sum and substance. She resented the fact that I was working till all hours, weekends, anytime, if there's a sick script. And one night she saw him on a talk show. He was asked, how come he's the only comic left who's doing a weekly, and it was on every single week. And there was no other show that was on every single week. No comedian. How is that possible? His answer to that question was, every week, when I get those lousy scripts from the writers, I yawn, and the voice of God tells me what to do.
Wow.
Well, that resulted in a big meeting.
Yeah.
With the network, with his manager, with his attorney, with everybody. And I said, he opened the meeting by saying, his remark was directed to me, are you an atheist? You know, crazy people, and I think he is and was crazy. The best defense is an offense.
Sure.
All of a sudden it was important whether I was an atheist or not. I said, I don't see what that has to do with the question. I said, I happen not to be an atheist. I believe in God. It may be a slightly different one than yours, but that's not the point. I do believe in God, but I believe the same God who yawns and tells you what to do, maybe he yawns and tells me what to write. So I don't think we're that far apart. But his attorney thought we were very far apart. And it became ugly.
Yeah.
And I said goodbye. And CBS never, no network, not just network, nobody likes to break up a winning team, whether it's baseball or soccer or basketball, and we were #1, and you can't go further than that. So they said, we'll tell you, we'll do this. And they promised me stay, because they knew I wanted to do my own series. One of my ideas was Gilligan's Island. They knew I wanted to do that. And they said, wait, stay another year, we'll talk to him, and we'll give you another writer. I said, it's not a question of another writer. I'm getting along fine with the three of us. Well, we'll give you more money. I said, I didn't complain about the money. I said, this man's attitude is just a little more. I've stomached it now for 7 years or so. I don't want to stay here anymore. I said to my brother Al, who was then on the show, Jess Goldstein had died during this period. I said, Al, I'm going to quit the show, #1. #2, Red is going to have you fired. Al says, first of all, you're not going to quit the show because they pay you good money and because it's #1, so you're not going to quit. #2, what's your going have to do with me staying? I said, Al, this man is 5 years old. The only way he can get back at me is to fire you. He said, that's ridiculous. I said, well, if I were you, I would call my agent right now. Because it's one thing to leave a show and go get another job. It's another thing to get fired and then go get another job. My brother Al is like the nicest guy who ever lived. He didn't dream that anybody could be that vindictive. He was just too nice, really. All his life he was too nice. In other situations, too. I mean, I think I'm nice, but I ain't that nice. I mean, he is nice to his own, was nice to his own detriment. And so C. Sparker had to tell Red that I was leaving. And if I can quote him, there's certain phrases you remember. I said to him, Sherwood is leaving the show this coming year. And he said, his beady eyes, it's his own words, his beady eyes just went around a couple of times, and then he said, fire that other fucking Schwartz. That's the only comment he made about me leaving.